Welcome to this explainer. There's this massive myth floating around that the bigger a corporation gets, the more it just completely loses its ability to innovate. Well, today, we're going to absolutely shatter that idea. We're taking a deep dive into the incredibly successful and honestly, wildly different innovation playbooks of three absolute giants: 3M, Tesla, and Apple.
I mean, it's a super common assumption, isn't it? Do big companies actually innovate? Or do we just kind of naturally assume that true game-changing innovation only happens in a garage with a bunch of scrappy startup founders? It's really easy to think the whole corporate grind, the endless planning cycles, the safety protocols, the layers upon layers of middle management, just naturally kills creativity. But as we're going to see today by looking under the hood of these top performers, that is simply not true.
But before we look at the companies themselves, we've got to talk about the fundamental hurdle of literally all innovation. It's called the Valley of Despair. Jeffrey Moore coined this in his book Zone to Win, and basically it's this critical, really uncomfortable period where you invest heavily in a transformative new idea, and your performance actually takes a massive nosedive before you ever see a breakthrough. Real innovation, it requires intentionally sheltering your teams through this massive dip. You can't just cross your fingers and rely on luck or raw talent. You have to build an operating system specifically designed to survive it.
So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to look at the corporate innovation myth, check out 3M's balancing act, explore Tesla's amplified capital, and dive into Apple's expert-led structure. And then we'll pull back the curtain on the one ultimate common denominator they all share.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, 3M and Balancing Innovation Horizons.
Let's talk about a company that kind of just silently operates in the background yet consistently wins the National Medal of Technology. 51%. That is 3M's average gross margin over incredible 20-year runs. Most of us just think of them as the Post-it note company, but they hit these massive margins by meticulously balancing their present core business with a heavy, heavy focus on the future. They aren't just hoping for a light bulb moment, they actually engineer innovation directly into their margins by defining exact investment horizons.
And they maintain that razor-sharp edge through something called the 30% rule. Basically, 3M literally mandates that a third of a division's revenue absolutely must come from products that were introduced in just the last 4 years. I mean, think about what that does to a company's DNA. It creates this constant, healthy tension. There is zero resting on your laurels when a massive chunk of your ongoing income relies entirely on the bleeding edge of your product line.
Now, to actually make that 30% rule work, 3M physically structures their research into three very distinct tiers. First, you've got business unit labs focusing on near-term, specific markets. Then you have sector labs, looking, say, 3 to 10 years out at totally new product applications. And finally, you have the corporate labs. They're the ones tackling the really basic research for 10 to 20 years out. They perfectly insulate the long-term dreamers from those intense, short-term, quarterly pressures of the business units.
And to empower the brilliant folks working across those distinct horizons, 3M offers multiple funding avenues. Like if your boss says no to seed capital for your wild idea, you're not dead in the water. You can actually go straight to corporate for a Genesis grant, which, fun fact, is exactly how the Post-it note got funded in the first place. And if you've got a product idea, you can use their new ventures system. It is literally like internal speed dating. Inventors actually recruit their own dream teams from across the entire company to tackle a challenge, completely risk-free.
But here's the absolute kicker: retention. 3M keeps its top talent around by offering dual career paths. This means brilliant scientists can climb the corporate ladder and get the exact same prestige, the same paychecks, and the same perks as the big executives without ever being forced to become managers. The whole philosophy is, don't lose a genius engineer just to gain a terrible manager. That deep structural respect for expertise is everything.
All right, moving right along to Section 2, Tesla and Amplifying Innovation Capital.
Shifting away from 3M's quiet, methodical lab model, Tesla's entire approach is driven by a highly visible CEO, heavily leveraging what the Harvard Business Review calls innovation capital. Basically, this is an innovator's actual ability to deliver on wild ideas. It boils down to who you are, who you know, and what your track record actually is. Tesla uses its leaders' massive track record to attract the insane mountain of resources you need to completely shift the global automotive market away from combustion engines.
And to wield that capital, they use these massive headline-grabbing moves. Like, remember the claim that the Cybertruck will be waterproof enough to serve briefly as a boat? Seriously, a boat.
Tesla uses these seemingly absurd claims as impression amplifiers. It stretches the minds of consumers and grounds visionary, almost impossible ideas right into reality. It builds this huge aura of what if that generates massive momentum and funding long before a product ever hits the assembly line.
But listen, headlines alone don't build cars, right? They pair those amplifiers with a super concrete roadmap of massive bets. Step 1, cast a huge vision to transform the industry. Step 2, deliver the core products to actually prove it, the models S, 3, X, and Y. And step 3, they completely open source their intellectual property. Now, why would they give away the secret sauce? Because they absolutely had to organically accelerate the global battery and charging ecosystem that their cars depended on. They basically handed out the blueprint so the rest of the industry would build the infrastructure right alongside them.
You simply cannot pull off this kind of rapid, high-stakes disruption without incredibly deep expertise at the very top of your decision matrix. At Tesla, this isn't just about having rock-star software engineers, it's about having absolute subject matter experts running the nitty-gritty stuff, like supply chain and finance. They are owning their bill of materials down to the molecular component level. You absolutely need deep, technical knowledge to disrupt traditional supply chains that heavily.
Okay, Section 3, let's look at Apple. Experts leading experts.
Let's explore how Apple uses a completely unique functional structure to heavily insulate true innovation. Most massive companies use a traditional multi-divisional structure. That's where each product line basically acts like its own mini-company with its own independent profit and loss responsibility. While Apple completely throws that out the window, they use a functional structure. Their senior vice presidents are responsible for functions, like engineering or marketing, company-wide. Because of this, the finance team is totally insulated from the product roadmap. Engineering and user experience aren't constantly getting compromised or watered down by some isolated pricing decision.
This whole structure is driven by a core philosophy that Steve Jobs introduced during a massive reorganization back in 1998. He realized that bringing in typical professional management just didn't work. So he dismissed the idea of general managers entirely in favor of deep experts. He wanted top individual contributors who only take on management roles because they literally don't trust anyone else to do as good a job. Apple operates on this firm belief that it's vastly easier to train an expert to manage well than it is to train a manager to be an expert.
Because traditional P&L cost isn't the immediate driving factor dictating a product's fate. Apple relies instead on intense reputational accountability. In a highly visible, cross-functional environment like theirs, your reputation is literally everything. This is exactly why Apple delayed the iPhone 7 Plus portrait mode for an entire year just to perfect the live preview feature. Think about it. A traditional general manager would have almost certainly forced that launch to hit quarterly financial targets. But an expert leader, they protect their reputation by waiting for absolute perfection.
Apple scales this whole expert-led environment through a discretionary leadership model. Basically, leaders are expected to know the absolute details of their organization 3 levels deep. They focus completely on the highest value activities where they have core, personal expertise. But just as importantly, they explicitly define their gaps in knowledge, and they delegate those gaps. This doesn't just guarantee that expert eyes are on every single problem, it proactively creates leadership opportunities to upskill the rest of their teams.
All right, bringing it all together. Section 4, the ultimate common denominator. So we've explored 3M's decentralized horizons, Tesla's innovation capital, and Apple's functional expertise. Let's finally connect the dots here. Consider Malcolm Gladwell's famous 10,000 hours rule. It reminds us that true mastery takes time. Creating something that people thought was literally unachievable, whether that's a revolutionary new adhesive, a mass-market electric vehicle, or a supercomputer in your pocket, it requires over a decade of intense, unbroken dedication to a craft. General, surface-level management simply cannot lead you there.
So here is the crucial point of this shared playbook. Whether you are 3M, Tesla, or Apple, the secret to surviving that brutal valley of despair is intentionally shielding your teams and aligning their rewards with distinct investment horizons so they actually have the time to build. But the ultimate key, the absolute through line running through all 3 of these massive corporate success stories, is demanding that experts lead experts.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to really ask yourself a provocative question about your own workspace. Are you enabling expertise to be elevated and supported to the highest levels of leadership? Because as we've seen today, true world-changing innovation is rarely just managed. It is expertly led. Thanks so much for learning with me today. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.